And greetings, friends. Today I want to talk to you about Romans, the 14th chapter, verse 5 and 6, that says this: One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. A lot of people take this to mean that the Sabbath is no different than any other day of the week, in that we are free to pretty much choose whichever day we wish to observe. So if you want to go to church on Sunday, that's your Sabbath, that's fine. Saturday, that's fine too. And a lot of people say, well, I remember I got this phone call once and this person said to me, Peter, every day is the Sabbath, as it says here. Another esteemeth every day alike. A lot of people say, every day is a Sabbath for me, Pete. And I said, really? Well, then when do you work? If every day is the Sabbath, when do you work? Kind of caught him off guard there. But is this true? Is this what the Apostle Paul is telling us? As long as you are persuaded in your own mind, you can pick whichever day you wish to worship Almighty God as the Sabbath. And of course, Sunday keepers use this to justify Sunday worship. Is that what the Apostle Paul is telling us here? Well, as I keep insisting, context is key when you're looking at these verses. And when you understand the context, you will find that this doesn't mean the Sabbath. In fact, the Sabbath is never mentioned in the book of Romans. Now, the law is, as a whole, which of course includes the Sabbath day. And notice what the Apostle Paul says about the law. These are just a few scriptures in the epistle to the Romans about the law of God, which of course includes the Sabbath day. Romans 7:12, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and just and good. Romans 2:13, the doers of the law will be justified. So if people who keep the law of God, including the Sabbath, will be justified. Romans 7:22, I delight in the law of God. This is what the Apostle Paul says about the law. Now, if this meant the Sabbath, then it's pretty inconsistent with these other statements, don't you think? Well, of course it is, but it's not talking about the Sabbath. It's actually talking about other days, which we will get into when you understand the context. And the context begins in verse 1. Notice what he says here. Him that is weak in faith, receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations, or for decisions of doubt. Now, these are personal beliefs that people had coming into the church. Personal beliefs, but as long as they didn't contradict the law of God, well then, the Apostle Paul says, let them believe their personal beliefs. Let them keep their personal beliefs. That's fine, because it doesn't violate the law of God. As it says in Romans, the 4th chapter, verse 15, where no law is, there is no transgression. So if you have a personal belief that you want to keep, other church members should be okay with it, as long as it does not transgress the law of God. And this is what he's saying. Now you got to remember, this is a Jewish and Gentile church, and there's various backgrounds in this church, even with the Jews. There were some Pharisees in the church, Sadducees, Essenes were in the church, as well as Gentiles. Now notice verse 2. It says, for one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. So here he's talking about one believes that we can eat meat and fish and vegetables, but the weak in faith believe, no, we should just eat, vegetables and not meats. And the Apostle Paul is saying these are personal beliefs, and as long as it doesn't contradict the law, well then that's fine. Let him keep his personal beliefs. Let's not have disputes over this, because it doesn't contradict the law of God. Where no law is, there is no transgressions. And then in verse 4 it talks about, in the end, God will judge the person on these personal beliefs, so don't worry about it, as long as it doesn't contradict the law of God. Now notice, the People's New Testament, it talks here about the Essenes. There were Essenes in the church, and they believed that the regenerate man should only eat vegetables, like the primitive race in Eden. Hence, for one or all of these causes, some thought meat ought to be abstained entirely. Disputes arose over the difference, and that's in the People's New Testament. So here are disputes about vegetarianism and eating meat. And as long as it didn't contradict the law of God, the Apostle Paul is saying, let them keep their beliefs. Let's not have these disputes. And in the end, God is going to judge everybody for their personal beliefs, as it says in verse 4. Now notice verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, to the Lord he doth regard it. Now people tend to stop there, and they don't read the rest of the verse, and the rest of the verse gives you the context. It says, he that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks. And he that eateth not, to the Lord he eateth not, and gives God thanks. So here he's talking, there is a connection with these days and either eating or fasting on these certain days. As we see here, Everett Harrison in his Bible Expositor's commentary, page 146, says, the close contextual association with eating suggests that Paul has in mind a special day set apart for observance as a time for feasting or as a time for fasting. So these days, there was a connection with these days and fasting. And if you notice, there is no biblical connection between the weekly Sabbath observance and fasting. There is no connection. So for people to say this is the Sabbath day, you have to pretty much take it out of context and put your interpretation into it to say that the Apostle Paul is talking about the Sabbath day. But when we keep it in context, he's talking about certain days, certain fast days that came about. Now remember, this is a mixed church of Jewish and Gentile. They had different cultural backgrounds. And certain fast days came about that the Jews celebrated. The Jews celebrated certain fast days, and the Gentiles had no connection with these fast days. And this is why he says when one day comes around, a certain fast day, and Jewish people wanted to, in the church, wanted to celebrate them, that's fine, go ahead, fast, and you're fasting to the Lord. But the Gentiles really don't have a cultural connection with these fast days. So if they want to eat during these days, they can, as long as it does not violate the law of God. Again, the context, when we go back to Romans the 14th chapter, verse 1 and 2, he's talking here about personal choices. Personal choices that were taking place in the church, and as long as it didn't violate the law of God, then that's fine. Let these people make their personal choices. So when it says he that regardeth the day, it meant regards the day of fasting, fast days. If there's certain fast days that came about, and certain people wanted to observe these fast days, well then that's fine. Now when you look at these days that the Apostle Paul was referring to, these were traditional fast days that were mentioned in Zechariah the 7th chapter, verse 5 and 6. The Gentile Christians in Rome did not keep them because they had no cultural interest in these anniversary fast days that were observed by the Jews that took place when they were in captivity in Babylon. These 4 traditional fast days mentioned by Zechariah was the fast in the 4th month, remembrance of breaking the walls of Jerusalem, the fast in the 5th month, remembrance of the burning of the temple, and the fast in the 7th month, the killing of Gedaliah, which completed the dispersion, and the fast in the 10th month, in remembrance in the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem that you read of in Jeremiah 52, verse 6, 12 through 13, and 2 Kings 1, 3, 8, and 25. Now, you'd be interested to know that these dates commemorate the judgments of God upon a people who refuse to keep the Sabbath day holy. Read Jeremiah 17, 19 through 29. So these are man-made fast days to commemorate certain things that happened to the Jews. Why would Gentile Christians want to celebrate them? But there were disputes, as we've seen in verse 1. There were disputes in the church over personal beliefs of vegetarianism or eating clean meats. And here is a dispute about fast days. Jews kept these certain fast days and they wanted the Gentiles to do the same. And the Gentiles said, we have no cultural connection to why should we keep these fast days? And this is why the Apostle Paul said about these days, he that regardeth the day, meaning a fast day, he regarded it unto the Lord. And he that regardeth not the day, the fast day, to the Lord, he doth not regard it. He that eateth to the Lord. These are Gentile Christians. During these fast days, if he wants to eat and give God thanks, he can. For he give God thanks, and he that eateth not, these are Gentile Christians who are keeping these fast days and they're not eating. To the Lord he eateth not, and gives God thanks. So that's the whole context. It's not speaking of the Sabbath whatsoever. It's talking about these certain days where the Jews commemorated by fasting. Jewish Christians in the church were keeping these days. They wanted the Gentile Christians to keep them. And the Apostle Paul says, no, they don't need to keep them. And it didn't violate the law of God. So if they wanted to continue to eat on those certain days, they could. And if you Jews wanted to commemorate these fast days, go ahead, that's fine. It doesn't contradict the law of God whatsoever. So if you want to keep them, go ahead. But don't force it on other people that have absolutely no connection to these fast days. Now, to all those that think that you can choose your Sabbath, whichever day you choose is fine with God, well, when you look into the Bible, we find that Almighty God chose a certain day. Almighty God made a certain day holy, and Almighty God said that this is the day that we should observe because it's His day, and it's the day that He chose, and it's the day that He wants us to celebrate. And that's the seventh day, as He says, from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. As God says, you shall count your Sabbaths from sunset to sunset, from even to even. That's the day that He chose, and that's the day that we are to assemble, as it says, assemble and worship Almighty God on that particular day. Now, to those that say that every day is the Sabbath, notice what Bacciochi writes here in his book, Sabbath in the New Testament, page 179. The belief that every day is the Sabbath is absurd. The end result is that no real worship is offered to God because nothing really matters. These use deceptive devices designed to do away both with the belief and worship of God. The theory that every day is a Sabbath ultimately results in no Sabbath at all because it's not special. One day out of the week is special. It's picked. It's holy. If every day is a Sabbath, then no day is special. The Sabbath is special. It's the day that we should observe because Almighty God commanded it. Almighty God brought it into existence. Almighty God kept it. And Almighty God made it holy. And that's the day that Almighty God wants us to observe. So to say that these scriptures prove that we don't need to keep God's Sabbath anymore is just another Bible misconception.